Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight, we have again the master history researcher, Cory Hughes. He is back with another amazing presentation. Before I bring him on, I want to tell you about how you can protect yourself from harmful EMF radiation. Did you know that the phone, computer, or tablet you're using right now to watch this video is emitting harmful EMF radiation? EMF radiation is scientifically proven to interfere with many physiological processes in the body and harm us in many ways, most especially the brain and nervous system. In fact, children's brains absorb more than twice the amount of EMF radiation as adults, which means it's important not only to protect yourself, but your children. Check out EMF Harmonize. They offer protection for your phone, computer, or tablet, and routers. I have one on my computer and also on my cell phone, as you can see. I've already noticed the difference. I'm not feeling as groggy. I'm sleeping better at night. And I have more energy during the day, even after spending hours in front of my computer and near my phone. The products were created by a mechanical engineer with 3 decades experience in EMF and telecommunication. You can check it out by clicking the link below. Check out EMF Harmonize and protect yourself today. Also, we have an amazing new opportunity for you to mine your own cryptocurrency with a new Helium Miner. You can now get one for free. By deploying the simple Helium hotspot in your home or office, you can provide your city with miles of low-power network coverage for billions of devices and earn new cryptocurrency, HNT. Mining HNT with hotspots is done via radio technology, not expensive or wasteful GPUs. Hotspots work together to form a new global wireless network and undertake proof of coverage. You can start earning cryptocurrency right now by connecting your hotspot to the network with your mobile phone, and that's it. Just click the link in the description to get your free hotspot with free shipping right now. I mean, you can't beat free money. Cory, we had ours for how long and how much has our miner earned already?
It's averaging about 30 a month, figure one token a day. And that's because there's a lack of other miners in the area. As more miners start to come into the area, more proof of coverage will go into place, and therefore more token generation will occur. So yeah, but it's doing good. It's a bunch of free money.
Yeah, can't beat free money. Also, subscribe to Forbidden Knowledge News on lbry.com. It's our official backup channel. We have also a brand new show called Beyond Classified. It's exclusively on Rokfin. Rokfin's an amazing new uncensored platform for free-thinking content creators, independent media, sports, tons of wrestling. You can also find all your favorite content creators. Plenty of them are already there, and all the content you can't see on YouTube anymore, all the controversial stuff that they're kicking off of YouTube. We'll be talking about it on Rokfin. And you can also get tickets to Forbidden Knowledge NewsCon 2021, which is going to be April 2nd, 3rd, and 4th with 12 amazing presenters. Just visit forbiddenknowledge.news to check out this year's awesome lineup and get your tickets today. All those links can be found in the description. Cory, welcome back. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you.
You know, if all of you don't know by now, Cory has been researching and dissecting the assassination of JFK for a few years and has uncovered more information than any other researcher out there alive right now. Tonight, he's going to be basically taking apart a work of either pure disinformation or stupidity. I'm not sure which one. I'm leaning towards disinformation. The book that he's going to be going over and kind of picking apart is called On the Trail of Delusion, Jim Garrison, the Great Accuser. Now, just right there in the title, that should throw up some red flags for you, but it's a great opportunity to show how this disinformation gets out there and for you all to learn more about this event that paved the way for everything that we're seeing right now, basically. I believe that this was one of the most important events in modern history, and it did pave the way for the dystopia that we're living in today. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you, Cory. Also, if you have any questions during the presentation, please leave them in the chat and we'll try and get to them. So Cory, what have you got for us tonight?
Okay, so I have a real problem with quote unquote investigators or researchers who still try to push the government line that Oswald shot President Kennedy. It is hilarious to me because I've spent the last 2.5 years, July will be 3 years, as what I consider to be a full-time JFK researcher. And that means that I put in, 30 to 40 hours a week of research. That has not changed since I began. I have an understanding of the assassination pretty much top to bottom. The minutia still escapes me at times, and I'm going to be working on this for the rest of my life. However, when people come along like Mr. Fred Litwin and put out books like On the Trail of Delusion, I take it personally offensive. These people are they are pushing government propaganda, whether they realize it or not. Most of the people who I see pushing narratives like this, I always feel like they were government disinformation agents, but I don't really know in the modern era how much time and money the CIA dedicates to JFK debunkers. So I think this modern wave of debunkers that we see, they come about because they have some kind of ego about them that tells them that they can show that it absolutely was not a conspiracy and basically make a name for themselves by swimming against the stream, so to speak. People who think that Oswald pulled the trigger on John F. Kennedy, I consider to be so absolutely lazy in their research that, if they had actually taken the time to study the book depository and read the statements of the people who worked in the book depository, they might come to the same conclusion that I have, that Oswald never, ever worked in the book depository. And I can explain the logistics of how that works, but that will have to be done another time. Let me go ahead and screen share. Okay, so on the trail of the debunkers, the deconstruction of Fred Litwin. Fred Litwin, he really is, it's a disappointment. It was a disappointment reading his book. I figured that he might actually have some documents that make me second guess my work. And is that what I found? Absolutely not. That is not what I found at all. I found a guy who likes to cherry pick information. He likes to use quotes and documents out of context. And he really, he's not even good at being a debunker. As we shall see. I've picked some overall themes and questions that he tries to answer in his book that I'm going to correct him on. And so let us begin. So one thing that I found when I was reading through Mr. Litman's book, which basically is nothing more than a series of attacks on Jim Garrison. He focused the book on Jim Garrison. The entire book, for the most part, attempts to show that Garrison was crazy. The CIA was not involved with the assassination. Clay Shaw was not actively working for the CIA at the time of the assassination, and that Clay Shaw was just an innocent gay man who Garrison decided to pick on. Nothing could be further from the truth. So back in 2012, there was a document leak. They say it was from Karl Rove. It was called Tactics for Effective Conservative Blogging. This is a really important document because it kind of shined a light on some of the tactics that people use in politics to kind of discredit their opposition. And I found many of the tactics in the document from Karl Rove actually were laced throughout the book. When you don't really have a substantial position to take, you have to resort to secondary tactics. And that's exactly what Mr. Litwin did in his book. And so I wanted to go over this document with you real quick, just to show you what kind of tactics these people use when they don't really have facts to defend their position. Engage, demand an elaborate time-consuming comparison analysis between your position and theirs. Entangle, insist that the opposition put their posts in their own words. That will consume the most time and effort for the opposition. They will be unable to spread numerous points on numerous blogs if you have them occupied. Allowing the opposition to post a web link is too quick and efficient for them. Tie them up. We are going for delay of game here. Now, this document, when it came out, was specifically written for conservative bloggers, but really it's just a rehashing of old political tactics. And so here, when I says like the opposition, I changed that to the opposition from like liberal, whatever they were, word they were using in that place. But those are pretty much the only changes that I made to this. And you'll find that these tactics actually apply quite well. Demoralize, dismiss their narrative as rubbish immediately. Do not even read it. Once the opposition goes through the trouble to research, gather, collate, compose. Sorry about that. Once the opposition goes through the trouble to research, gather, collate, compose, and write their narrative, your job is to discredit it. Make it obvious you toss their labor-intensive narrative aside like garbage. This will have the effect of demoralizing the opposition. It will make them unwilling to expend the effort again, and for us, that is a net win. Attack. Attack the source. Any opposition website or information source must be marginalized, trivialized, and discounted. Let the blogosphere know they are rubbish propaganda. Discredit sources of information whenever possible. Confuse. Challenge the opposition position with questions. Always questions. The questions need not be relevant. The goal is to knock the opposition off their game and seize control of the narrative. Once you have control, you can direct the narrative to where you want it to go, which is always away from letting the opposition make their point. Conversely, do not respond to their leading questions. Don't rise to their bait. Contain. Your job is to prevent the presentation and spread of opposition viewpoints. Do anything you must do to prevent the opposition from presenting a well-reasoned argument or starting a civil discussion. Don't allow the opposition to present their dogma unchallenged, ever. Intimidate. Taunt the opposition. If you find yourself in a debate where you're losing a fact-based argument, then call them a name to derail their diatribe. Remember, your goal is to prevent a meaningful exchange of views and ideas which may portray the opposition in a positive light. Your goal is to stop the spread and advance of the opposition agenda. Play upon any identifiable idiosyncrasies, character flaws, physical traits, names to their disadvantage. Monitor the opposition for vulnerabilities you can exploit. Stay on the offensive with the opposition wimps. Don't let up. Insult their movement. Assign as many character and moral flaws to the opposition as you can. You must portray them as weak, vacillating, indecisive, amoral, etc. Patriotism. Always claim the high ground of pro-military, low taxes, strong defense, morality, and religion. We own those virtues. Learn how to exploit them when debating. Demean. Always refer to the other side as crazy, conspiracy theorists, etc. Never assign them a status of a bona fide position. And opportunity. Be alert for ways to insert our catchphrases into your narrative. Consistent, persistent repetition and inculcation will drive our talking points home, and so will neuro-linguistic programming. Stick with it, and our talking points will become truth. If they debunk your talking point, ignore it and move on as if you didn't hear it. So,
and welcome to reality of every day.
Yes. So, that is what's going on behind the scenes in the world of conservative blogging. And I will just say overall opposition, right? Government opposition. And so when I was reading through Mr. Litwin's book, I just kept coming across these tactics over and over and over again, present arguments and don't back them up and all kinds of stuff. I mean, it was really pathetic. The book is really poorly written. There's no real thesis to it other than to just call Garrison names and defend Clay Shaw, which is indefensible. So the next thing I want to go over is a few pages from the official CIA Manual of Trickery and Deception. Now, I wanted to go over this briefly because throughout Kennedy, I often talk of the use of tradecraft or spycraft. And there are body doubles all throughout the Kennedy assassination. Lee Harvey Oswald had a double. Marguerite Oswald had a double. Jack Ruby had a double. David Ferrie had a double. Everybody has a double. Nobody is who they say they are. And so I thought it very important to go over some of these pages just to kind of show that I'm not making this stuff up and that the CIA actually did this stuff. So, and I have to apologize, much of this presentation will be just me just reading to you. But disguises can also be used with greater speed and creativity than sometimes imagined, when in less than a second, a magician's assistant is transported from one side of the stage to the other. There can be no apparent explanation for the audience except it's magic. Illusionists perform similar feats nightly, and Houdini's mysterious disappearance through a newly constructed brick wall act was one of his most famous illusions. R.D. Adams, the craftsman who constructed Houdini's magical apparatus, described the illusion. A dozen or more bricklayers in overalls appeared before the audience and built a bona fide brick wall 7 or 8 feet high, extending from the footlights to almost the rear of the stage. When it was completed, Houdini was ready to disappear. After a few appropriate remarks, he stepped behind the small screen, something like a prompter's box, which the bricklayers pushed slowly to the center of the wall. The bricklayers moved over to the other side and adjusted a similar screen there opposite the first one. Here I am, Houdini would shout, waving his arms through the holes in the screen. It gave evidence of the fact. Then the arms would disappear and Houdini would step forth from the screen on the other side of the wall. At the time, respected skeptics speculated that Houdini did this by using a trap door, which allowed a secret passage from one side of the stage to the other. Such speculation was inaccurate, however, since the investigating committee that validated the integrity of each performance would have detected the trap door. To confound the audience in later performances, Houdini even placed a sheet of paper or sheet of glass beneath the wall to demonstrate that the trapdoor was not used. The secret, Adams explained, was Houdini disappeared through the wall only in the minds of the exceedingly gullible. As a matter of fact, while the first screen behind which he had stepped was being pushed back against the wall, he leaped into a pair of blue jumpers and pulled a workman's cap down far over his face. When the screen touched the wall, he was one of the bricklayers as far as the audience was concerned. He got behind the second screen disguised as the bricklayer. From this point, he did his calling to the audience. Mechanical arms and hands operated by a hidden rope leading to the wings furnished the gestures which convinces Houdini was behind screen number 1 instead of screen number 2, completing the illusion. Such a baffling and effective illusion can also be accomplished by employing identical or disguised twin. One assistant seems to vanish and almost instantly reappear in another location, sometimes for effect even suspended above the stage. To deceive the audience, the lovely blonde assistant and her replacement must be of similar body type, dress in similar attire, using the same makeup and hair. To the audience, who never sees them together to form a comparison, they appear identical. The less time the audience has to scrutinize the elements of the deception, such as details of the assistant's appearance, the more effective the illusion. The magician never announces the deception in advance. The audience has no opportunity or reason to scrutinize any of the onstage participants. At the CIA, the identical twin illusion became known as identity transfer. An officer would disappear from one location and reappear somewhere else as the same or a different person. When this was properly staged, surveillance teams were never aware of the switch, and officers were able to evade hostile surveillance prior to performing operational acts. Successful CIA identity transfers involved the entire Little Theater presentation, which was performed for several hours before the swap took place. The actual transfer required only a few minutes at the most and was nearly impossible for even a trained observer to detect. The stage scenario presented to surveillance was geared towards fooling their minds rather than just fooling their eyes. Disguise was critical, but only one element of the magic demanded by an identity transfer illusion, whether performed in an auditorium or on the street. And for me, one of the single best examples of this, which no other JFK researcher seems to have put the pieces together on so far. Here on the left, you see Jack Ruby, and he's at the midnight press conference. On the right, you also see Jack Ruby, and he's in the hallway of the Dallas Police Department. Here's another picture, allegedly, of Jack Ruby inside the Dallas Morning News just after the assassination. But I can tell you for certain, this is not, and neither of these two pictures are Jack Ruby. These are Jack Ruby. This is Jack Ruby's brother, Samuel. Now, how do we know this? And how do we know that this is not Jack Ruby here on the telephone in the Dallas Morning News? Well, a couple years before the assassination, Jack Ruby had his left index finger bitten off in a bar fight. Okay? So he did not have a left index finger. But sure enough, this person talking on the phone has a left index finger because it is not Jack Ruby, it is Samuel Ruby. Samuel Ruby pretended to be Jack Ruby numerous times over an 18-month period when Sam moved to Dallas, about 18 months before the assassination. Some of the people described Jack Ruby as a hothead who would kick your ass if you said something out of line, and other people said that he was a great guy and he never engaged in any violence. They're obviously describing two different people here. So this is Samuel Ruby, as we have seen, and here is a picture of the two of them together. This is the only known photograph of Samuel. Trust me, I have looked high and low. Jack Ruby is on the right. Samuel Ruby is on the left. They were born less than a year apart. They are not twins, but they are pretty damn close. And here's some documentation on Samuel Ruby to show that he's not a figment of my imagination. There is next to nothing in the thousands of pages of documents that I've read. You could probably put all the Samuel Ruby documents into about, 10 or 15 pages, and most of it is very irrelevant. I learned more about Samuel Ruby by going through newspapers.com. Newspapers.com is the best $20 a month you can spend. If you like history, you can find out pretty much everything that the mainstream narrative says is false by going through historical newspapers. And so most of the information I have on Sam Ruby, I did get through newspapers.com. You will not find it in the work of any other researcher or in any of the Warren Commission volumes or anything like that. It's really quite a shame.
He looks just enough like him to be a good enough double. Just
enough, right? Not identical, but it said right. Not, it said didn't have to be identical. It just had to be close, and then not scrutinized. And these guys did a good job. See, these guys were running with the mob and the Mossad and the CIA for like 20 years before the assassination. So, Jack Ruby used to work for George White, who ran the MK Ultra program. So, okay. So the first thing, this is a very specific breakdown of Littman's book. And the first thing we're going to talk about was Louis Bloomfield a remarkable person or a traitor? He goes out of his way to lavish praise on Louis Bloomfield, but Louis Bloomfield is a Mossad scumbag who actually, after the assassination, they built a stadium for him over in Israel. So it's, let me just hop right into this. So this is from Littman's book. He talks about how crazy Garrison is. And he said, one forgotten victim was Louis Bloomfield, a Montreal lawyer whose papers are housed at the Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa. I come across this name in my research for my book. I was a teenage JFK conspiracy freak, as he was named by the Italian newspaper Pesa Sera in 1967 as being involved, along with Clay Shaw, in the World Trade Center in Rome, which it claimed was a CIA front. At the time, I didn't consider Bloomfield to be important because so much was in Pesa Sera was just plain false. His criticism of Pesa Sera is blatantly wrong. And then see what he does here, just to point out a technique that he uses. He says, I didn't consider Bloomfield to be important because of so much of what was in Pesa Sera was just plain false. How was it false? Please explain to us why it was false. He doesn't ever attempt to do so. He just injects his own personal ignorance of how the world works into his writing. Since I live in Ottawa, however, I decided to look for myself as a suspected. Bloomfield's files and letters showed nothing sinister, bullshit, and confirmed that Pesa Sera got it all wrong. I learned that Bloomfield was a remarkable person, deeply involved in raising money for hospitals in Montreal and working hard to further ties between Canada and Israel. Yes, because he was a Mossad spy and co-founding the World Wildlife Fund in Canada. Okay, this guy is just as much of a shitbag as all the rest of these fucks. And he, as you'll see, his connections to Israel are overwhelming. There are in the Bloomfield papers many documents showing that Louis M. Bloomfield was acting as attorney for the Rothschild family, and particularly for Baron Edmund de Rothschild. According to the archives, this relation with the Rothschilds was dating back to the Second World War, at a time when Bloomfield had for a client Oscar Federer, the manager of Vitkovice Mining and Iron Corporation of Czechoslovakia, an industrial complex held by the Rothschilds. Victovice was at the time the most important steel plant of Central Europe. After Lionel Rothschild was arrested by the Nazis, both Goering and Himmler tried to gain control of the company in exchange of Lionel's liberation. Years after the war, Bloomfield was still an important attorney for the family, particularly for Baron Edmund. For instance, in 1959, the Montreal lawyer was responsible for incorporating in Canada a major Rothschild company, the Tricontinental Pipeline, a corporation that was granted by Israel 49 years exclusively on the use of 16-inch pipeline between the Red Sea and Haifa. See, so everything he's doing is about Israel, okay? Portion on the Mediterranean Sea. Through the Canadian corporation, Tricontinental Pipeline was able to save taxes that would otherwise have been paid to the state of Israel. Interestingly enough, on April 29, 1960, Bloomfield's letters show that Montreal lawyer was not only a business attorney of the Rothschilds, but was also a shareholder of Tricontinental Pipeline. The letter lists the 15 shareholders of the new corporation, and Bloomfield's name came second right after Baron Edmunds. Since 1968, since the first mention of Louis Mortimer Bloomfield's name as a Clay Shaw associate, bits of information and tons of speculation have been published about him. But to this day, the fact that Bloomfield was related to the Rothschilds was unknown from the public. Other documents revealed that Bloomfield met with George Bush Sr. in China, while the future U.S. president was chief of the United States Liaison Office in Peking between September 74 and December 75. Now, here we go, another connection. You got Jack Valente between 71 and 74, bouncing in and out of Peking on, for the MPAA. So, you got all these, you have the same shady people running in all the same shady circles. It gets really kind of old after a while, seeing the same names pop up. In January 76, 1 month after its return from China, Bush was promoted director of the Central Intelligence Agency. All of Bloomfield correspondence from those years will be kept secret until they reach 50 years of age. So those documents are still locked up. So you have Bloomfield, who works for the Rothschilds, who then goes and meets with George Bush in China. And then after that meeting, George Bush gets promoted to head of the CIA. Interesting. And this is Louis Bloomfield speaking with David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion is the man who greenlit the assassination. Okay, it doesn't get any higher. That's the top of the pyramid right there. And you got Louis Bloomfield with David Ben-Gurion. They were associates. They did know each other. I don't know how friendly their relationship actually was, but it was. All right, so just to illustrate how short the path from David Ben-Gurion to the shooters is this is all you need. David Ben-Gurion to Louis Bloomfield to Clay Shaw to David Ferry, the shooters. That's it. No Illuminati here. Okay, you don't have 50 million people in the military industrial complex, none of that stuff. Okay, this is how short the chain was. All right, so was Permindex just an international trade organization, or were there really some sinister CIA, organization for doing backroom deals and assassinations? It is most certainly the latter. These are the people who are most famously associated with CMC and Permindex. So you have Alan Dulles, who was the head of the CIA at the time. He also provided the funding for CMC through two banks, Seligman and Schroeder. Then you have James Angleton, who is the highest level Israeli operative that the United States ever had, possibly until Rahm Emanuel. Rahm Emanuel was a Mossad spy for Barack Obama. But at the time, 1963, James Angleton was the highest level infiltrated person in the United States government who did most of what he did on behalf of Israel. He's another crypto Jew. Then you have Tibor Rosenbaum, who established the money laundering operation through the Banque de Crédit International for Meyer Lansky. Okay, so these are the people who sat on the board of Permindex along with Clay Shaw, along with a bunch of Nazis, people connected to Hjalmar Schacht, and then Otto Skorzeny. I mean, this is a who's who of scumbags. The next guy over is Mo Dalitz. He was the mob boss of Detroit and Las Vegas. There's Louis Bloomfield on the right. Joe Bonanno, one of the five families out of New York. I mean, he sat on the board and invested in Permindex. And then you have Frank Nagy, who lived in Dallas at the time of the assassination and who was photographed in Dealey Plaza on that day. Then you have Clay Shaw, Jean de Menil, who we'll talk about more later, and his connection through the Schlumberger Corporation. And then you got Roy Cohn, who was Trump's lawyer in the 1980s. Okay, this is a who's who of intelligence and big business and scumbags. Okay, the CMC Permindex is the absolute proof that the mob, the CIA, and the mafia have worked together, always will work together because they are cut from the same cloth. Okay, some of the tangled threads from Dallas and New Orleans met in Rome behind the corporate facade of Centro Mondial Comercial. CMC's directors included CIA contract agent Clay Shaw, owner of the International Trade Mart in New Orleans. Shaw also sat on the board of a CMC subsidiary called Permindex. That's actually wrong. That should be vice versa. Permindex was the mother company. Other investors included Mo Dalitz, Joe Bonanno, and Cuban ex-president Carlos Prio Sacaras. Swiss authorities dissolved their branch of Permindex in 1962 after proving the firm delivered $200,000 to right-wing terrorists bent on killing French President Charles de Gaulle, and they would be referring to the OAS. The OAS was, they were kind of a paramilitary wing of the Corsican mafia, sort of. There's too much overlap between the Corsican Mafia and the OAS to separate them. And that's when you start getting into guys like Jean-Pierre Lafitte and Lucien Conin, and there's a whole bunch of, and then Spirito. There's a whole bunch of these French guys who were involved in the French Connection, who are all connected to these guys through Permindex. So yeah, I would say Permindex is most certainly just more than an international trade organization that failed.
We have a comment from Justonian Unitas saying politics are controlled by those guys that you're talking about, but it's not just politics. Everything, the media, corporations, everything that we see around us is controlled by those psychopaths that he was talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. But you have to remember, you have these bankers who are scumbags who run the world. These guys like Klaus Schwab, right, who are behind this COVID shit. And then you have intelligence, right? So really, intelligence is like what is used to grease the wheels. There are two different roles, two different functions, and they often get confused. You know, oh, the CIA did this. Well, the CIA doesn't do anything for themselves. They do it for their overlords. You know, usually over in Israel, everything seems to circulate around the Greater Israel Project. But this is just more documents on CMC, basically showing that, there are a bunch of scumbags, and these people are connected to all kinds of Nazis and all kinds of other people. A Montreal-based American, former major in the OSS by the name of Bloomfield. There were others who now escape me, but all were absurdly fascistic. The same group also incorporated in Switzerland under the name the Permadex Corporation, and the company was dissolved by the Swiss government when it was proven to be a conduit for funds for the Algerian Colon movement to the OAS. They later reincorporated under the same name in a more conducive city of Johannesburg. Furthermore, Le Devoir, a week before, carried a brief announcement from Le Monde of Paris that Pravda said Clay Shaw, through the connections in Rome, was an identified agent of the CIA. So the CIA admits that Clay Shaw was an agent. They say he was an agent from 48 to 56, but it's blatantly false. One document I found that actually indicated in 1945, after the war, Clay Shaw was involved in the anti-Cuban operations, and he had been the primary lessee of an airport in Venice, Florida. Okay, the same airport that some of the 9/11 hijackers took flying lessons at. Okay, so it was a CIA airport. These guys go out and they open businesses. They have all this money to do all this stuff, and it's really not theirs. It belongs to the CIA. Okay, that's one of the benefits of being a CIA agent. But make no mistake about it, all the stuff was owned by the CIA. The airport down in Venice is just proof that he was working with them before 48 when he said he was definitely a member of the OSS. That's documented. So all these guys who say they weren't CIA, but they only talked to him a little bit, if they were OSS, they were CIA. Okay, if you did 4 years in the OSS, they came and grabbed you on day one, May 1947. So just a few weeks before Admiral Strauss won his bid from Eisenhower to ascend in commerce, in the spring of 1958, Enrico Mantello, the vice president of Permandex and brother of Giorgio, who is actually George Mantello, the founder of Permandex, who was a Mossad spy. That's one of the things that these guys all get wrong. I think it's the CIA who started Permandex. It was not. It was the Mossad. Turning to trademark, he invited Clay Shaw to join the board of directors. Nagy appeared at the American Embassy in Rome to announce that he intended to strengthen the U.S. control in Permandex by adding Mr. Shaw, who was in charge of the New Orleans, Louisiana permanent exhibit. Okay, that's an extremely important verbiage right here, because it shows that Clay Shaw actually was in charge. He did not own the trademark, because the trademarks were all owned by Permandex. A Farewell to Justice by Joan Mellon, that's where that came from. Joan Mellon's a weird one. She puts out some stuff that's really, really good, and then she's like, but I don't know what it all means. It's like, fuck. Nagy claimed that Shaw had from the outset great interest in Permandex project. When Shaw added his Permandex directorship to the who's who in South and Southeast, the Department of Commerce warned Shaw about this shadowy organization. Sure. The shadowy organization that Commerce was soon officially promoting. It's not known to this research to what extent Secretary Strauss aided the fledgling Permandex, either promoting or protecting only that he was in the right place at the right time and used the same language, permanent exhibitions, in his presentations on their nuclear trade in Atoms for Peace. The peaceful U.S. conferees in Geneva were selling their floor model reactors right out of their shiny showrooms. And that is from Jennifer Lake's blog. If you haven't ever heard of Jennifer Lake, look up Jennifer Lake's blog. It's amazing. It stuns me every time I go through it, the information she's uncovered. After Clay Shaw's arrest, Jim Garrison received from Ralph Schoenman, philosopher Bertrand Russell's secretary in London, copies of a series of articles published in an Italian newspaper in the Independent called Pesa Sera. The articles had been assigned 6 months earlier to expose the CIA's pernicious attempt to influence European electoral politics and to thwart the democratic process in more than one country. They focused on Centro Mondiale Commerciale, the World Trade Center in Rome, as a CIA front, one modeled according to a 1958 State Department document on the original CIA-created international trademark in New Orleans. Okay, CIA-created international trademark in New Orleans. Pesa Sera, of course, did not possess this document. Its evidence came first-hand. So all of the attempts to debunk the Pesa Sera article, which he doesn't even do a very good job on, he just says they got it all wrong, doesn't explain anything. He obviously got that completely wrong. Centro Mondiale Commerciale was, by the U.S. government's own admission, a CIA front channeling money not only into legal political parties, but also into right-wing movements. Among them was the virulent paramilitary OAS, Organisation Armée Secrète, in France, which employed terrorism to impose the independence of Algeria. Now, Algeria gets deep. You get into Algeria and you got Israel up in there like crazy. And so that's why they were trying to take out Charles de Gaulle. They did not like what was going on there whatsoever. And it was among the most notorious fascist organizations in French history. In New Orleans, Guy Bannister and L.P. Davis had been OAS supporters. Of course they were. The most notorious OAS-sponsored effort was the attempted assassination of Charles de Gaulle in 1962. Bannister operative Tommy Baumler remarked that those who killed John F. Kennedy were those who wanted to kill de Gaulle. He was referring to CIA, Clay Shaw, Bannister, and Centro's parent organization, Permandex. the permanent industrial exhibition based in Switzerland. Having been accused of shady speculation by the Swiss, Permindex had created the Centro Mondiale Commerciale in Rome, ostensibly to develop industry and trade in Italy. The Centro, however, was a trade association that rarely, if ever, organized an exhibit. It facilitated no commercial transactions. The CIA had, in fact, founded Permindex to organize its political policymaking in Italy. This had meant opposition to a coalition of socialists and communists that would have resulted in a majority government. The CIA preferred the Christian Democratic Party, and so CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton filtered $10 million of CIA money to the Christian Democrats. In Les Echos newspaper, de Gaulle named Permindex as having been involved in the attempt on his life. The French, no less than the Italians, considered Permindex a subsidiary of the CIA. Pace Sarah would call Permindex a creature of the CIA set up as a cover for the transfer of CIA funds in Italy for illegal political espionage activities. One thing I need to point out here, when you go and you start really digging into Permindex, and the origins of Permindex and who founded it, it all goes back to George Mandel Mantello. Because he went to Italy and he called himself Mantello, just made it up out of thin air, just so he would sound Italian, but he wasn't. He was a Hungarian Jew, if I'm not mistaken, but he did everything he did for Israel. Permindex was a Mossad company, not a CIA company. However, when CIA came around, most of the players involved with CMC had connections to the CIA. It was kind of like their branch that they could kind of work with to funnel money around. So, but we have to go back to the meeting in 1945, Reinhard Gehlen, the Nazis, the Zionists, and the OSS all got together, formed a new cabal, and that's the cabal that runs the world today. Okay, so when people talk about the CIA, you can always interchange Mossad and CIA because they're like glued at the hip, and we most certainly take our orders from them. In the ranks of Permindex were actual Nazis and neo-Nazis, terrorists and mafia operatives. Typical was Prince Gutierrez de Spadafora, former Mussolini undersecretary whose son had married the daughter of Hitler's finance minister, Hjalmar Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht plays a role in the assassination. I'm not going to talk about that today. That actually you might have to wait for quite some time. Not real high on my list of priorities. But yes, Hjalmar Schacht was in contact with Oswald. The leadership of Permindex included longtime asset of CIA Deputy Director of Plans Frank Wisner. His name was Frank Nagy, and he was the president of Permindex. Nagy had been chairman of the Hungarian People Party, or Independence Party of Smallholders. Briefly, in 1945, he had been prime minister of Hungary. But it was Nagy's CIA history that catapulted him to the leadership of Permindex. Its General Secretary Bela Kovacs was also CIA asset. Kovacs had been arrested by the Soviet security police and charged with spying for a Western intelligence service. Nagy had been on Frank Wisner's list of the individuals with whom his office would have dealings in connection with our authorized activities since September 22nd, 1948. Wisner had been assistant director of CIA as well as assistant director for policy coordination. Nagy had been a cleared contact of the International Organizations Division of the agency, among Wisner's most trusted Eastern European contacts. Okay, so this, like I said before, Permindex is a who's who of intelligence, mafia, and all-around scumbags. And so I think that's Litwin's poor attempt to get people off of that trail. It failed miserably. The next thing we're going to talk about is, did Perry Russo see Oswald in New Orleans? So Garrison made a big deal over Perry Russo. He really shouldn't have. It was kind of an embarrassment for Garrison, and it should have been because he wasted a lot of time on Perry Russo for no reason. This is like the easiest mystery in all of Kennedy to solve. Perry Russo was allegedly a guy who was an insurance salesman. He was somehow connected to David Ferrie and all these guys. And he allegedly went to a party, and at that party, he saw Oswald and Ferrie and Clay Shaw, and they were talking about the assassination. So let's talk about Perry Russo and what he actually said. Perry Russo was testified that Oswald was a dirty, bearded beatnik roommate of a homosexual in New Orleans in mid-September. That's one statement. This is from Litwin's book. Litwin says, he then said that a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald was the person that Ferrie had introduced him to as his roommate. He said that the only thing that doesn't make sense, that doesn't make him stand up and say that he is sure beyond a shadow of any doubt, is the fact that the roommate was always so cruddy and had a bushy beard. He then drew a beard on the picture of Oswald and said this was Ferrie's roommate. Okay, so there's only one person in the entire assassination who meets the definition of having been a roommate of David Ferrie and was a dirty, bearded beatnik. Okay. It's so obvious, it's not even funny. So here's another one. Russo described Oswald as dirty and having whiskers. He also identified Clay Shaw as Clem Bertrand. Okay, he also identified Clay Shaw as Clem Bertrand, and we're going to get to that here momentarily. So, and the only person that could be is Kerry Thornley. Okay, Kerry Thornley is this is a rabbit hole into it in and of itself. Okay, so I'm not really going to talk too much about him, but Kerry Thornley was definitely a key player in the assassination. As far as the support people go, right? He wasn't like a major guy, but he did a lot of the Oswald setting up. He was one of the Oswald doubles. There are other pictures of him where he did, shaves his beard, combs his hair, and doesn't look like a dirty fucking hippie. And he was probably the one who was photographed in the backyard with Oswald with the rifle. That was probably Kerry Thornley. I'll have to do a show on Kerry Thornley in the future. It's a very complex person. So yeah, that was pretty simple. A dirty beatnik lived with David Ferrie and seen with Shaw. It's not really rocket science. Okay, so one of the big things was they were saying that Clay Shaw was Clay Bertrand, which is an alias that was used to hire a lawyer for Oswald, right? So Oswald gets arrested, and there's a guy named Dean Andrews who's a lawyer for a guy named Clay Bertrand. Clay Bertrand calls Dean Andrews and says, hey, will you represent Oswald? Okay. So it becomes a whole matter of if Clay Shaw was Clay Bertrand, then it was Clay Shaw who was hiring the lawyer for Oswald, and then there's a connection to the assassination there. Of course, he denied it. However, I think anybody who has any sense about them will very quickly come to realize that Clay Shaw was Clay Bertrand, and I shall go over those details now. This is just a photograph of Clay Shaw on an identification that he used to go down to Brazil. He was doing consular work all around the world. Why? To promote international trade? I don't think so. It was done at the behest of the CIA. So who exactly was Clay Shaw? He had served in World War II as aide-de-camp for General Charles Thrasher and was responsible for stockpiling supplies for the Normandy invasion. Shaw was a major at discharge in 1946 and received decorations from 3 different nations, including the Bronze Star, the Legion of Merit, and La Croix de Guerre. After the war, he returned to New Orleans and created the Center for International Trade in 1948. Becoming its managing director. In 1963, he oversaw the creation of a new trademark building on Canal Street. Shaw retired in 1965, and the city of New Orleans awarded him its International Order of Merit Medal. Okay, so basically, this whole book themed is that Clay Shaw was just an innocent gay guy, and so Litwin's perspective is just that Jim Garrison was going after Shaw just because he was gay, and he had no case, and all this stuff is a whole bunch of nonsense. Okay, so these are just the cover sheet right here for what I'm about to show you, but this is the library card of Clay Bertrand, which is the name Clem Bertrand is actually on, and it says Business International Trade Marked, okay? So you've got Clay Shaw, who's accused of being Clay Bertrand, and so this brings us back to aliases. So I've talked about this before, but these guys use real aliases of real people who they know, and they share these aliases amongst several other people. The best example, which is the most famous example in Kennedy, is Jean Suetre and Michael Mertz and Michael Roux, 3 Corsican assassins. Well, one of them was the Corsican assassin. The other 2 were not, but who was doing what, when, where? Nobody seems to know because they shared aliases, and that is probably the most famous example in the known JFK lore. Those guys were in Texas. They were not in Dealey Plaza at the time of the assassination, but it just goes to show that there is 3 names, 3 guys, and their real names, and they rotate them between the guys so to keep you guessing as to who was really there. And honestly, with those guys, I have no idea. But this is the same thing. So this allegedly is a real Clem Bertrand who was a bartender in the French Quarter in New Orleans. And I totally believe that. There was also speculation that a guy named Eugene Davis used the alias of Clem Bertrand, and I do not doubt that either. And then it is this right here with the indication of the international trademark as business. To me, this is slam dunk that Clay Shaw also used the name Clem Bertrand, besides the fact that we have numerous other people who heard him being introduced as Clem Bertrand. Oh, and one more thing I want to point out. This is why are library cards important here? Library cards pop up a whole bunch. Why does everybody have a freaking library card in the Kennedy assassination? Because libraries, much like the Texas Theater and the chain of theaters that it was connected to, and much like the Winterland Ice Skating Rink, which we'll talk about later, they were places that you can go under the cover of having a meeting for, board of directors this, meeting for this cover, whatever. But really what you're doing is you're going and you're meeting and you're doing CIA stuff or mob stuff. That's why libraries pop up throughout the assassination. Next, we're going to talk about a guy named Jules Rocco Kimball. This is an interesting guy. Pops up here, pops up in Martin Luther King investigation. He's one of these guys who came around kind of afterwards, talked to Garrison, gave some misleading stuff, but all these guys are liars, right? So when you're going through testimony of guys who you know are all liars, they all tell truth at different points, right? And so you have to kind of stitch this. You have to create a framework. You have to take the points of truth that these people have that are corroboratable and corroborate them, and then therefore you can create a framework for the assassination. But Jules Rocco Kimball was one of these guys who liked to go to Garrison and run his mouth. Some of the stuff he said was absolutely true. Some of it was absolutely false. But then again, these guys are also intentionally misled, and they're not let in on the whole story either. But here I just have one snippet from a document where he said that he had heard other people introduce Clay Shaw as Clay Bertrand, but it would never have been introduced to him in that way. So then you have this is testimony from Dean Andrews. I'm not going to read this. I have too much to get through. But Dean Andrews basically, tells a story of how he was in the hospital. He got the call. He recognized the voice as Clay Bertrand, and he goes and gets the lawyer for Oswald. And then he retracts that story. And one of the things that Litwin does is kind of funny. Is he's like, well, they don't ever tell you that Dean Andrews retracted that story. The conspiracy theorists will say, well, he identified Clay Shaw as Clay Bertrand, and then he retracted it. Right. So, so what? So what he retracted it? Someone's got a gun to your head. You're going to retract whatever they tell you to retract. Okay. Was Clay Shaw a sadist? He absolutely was a sadist. And I thought this was kind of funny. Garrison's thinking began to change once they found Shaw's whips and chains, which were proof of Shaw's position as Lord Executioner in the Society of Sadists and Masochists. Richard Billings wrote that Garrison's theory is bolstered somewhat by the fact that the searchers found hooks bolted into the ceiling beams and chains fitted with wristbands. There were indeed 2 hooks and a beam in Shaw's bedroom. When I first saw pictures of the hooks, they can be seen in the Richard Billings papers at Georgetown University. I was dumbfounded. They were quite tiny and looked more like the small hooks one would use for plants, which is what Clay Shaw said they were used for, rather than for hoisting people. Garrison told Billings that he was completely convinced that it was a plot by sadists. He had read the Marquis de Sade and knew that sadists escalated from whipping to killing. Well, we have a document here from the Garrison files, which is testimony from a guy named Griscom Morgan, who pops up periodically in Garrison's investigation. And I'll go ahead and I'll read to you what he relayed to Garrison. He says, my friend is acquainted with a man whose name I will not include here. He told my friend that his mother in New Orleans had been housekeeper to Clay Shaw. This lady is reported as terrified about the hazard to her from what she knows. This includes knowing of Ferry's association with Shaw, knowledge of the sadistic stuff, whips, etc. in the closet, and the mysterious death or killing of somebody in the house, whether an associate or not, is not known. There had been no police investigation, but a coroner had come and picked up the body. 2 men lived in the house, of which the lady was housekeeper. My friend is not sure of all the details, but this is the general picture that he got, right? So this is just a hearsay statement relayed to Jim Garrison about Clay Shaw. But this completely fits because they found whips and hooks and all kinds of stuff. They found, one of those executioner hoods. I mean, they found all this stuff. What's he doing? He's just going to Mardi Gras celebrations? I don't think so, okay? He was a hardcore sadist. He killed a guy in his fucking apartment, and then the coroner covered it up. That's who Clay Shaw is. Okay, this part of this is kind of fun. Did Clay Shaw know David Ferry? And he goes on extensively in his book about how David Ferry never knew Clay Shaw. There's nothing connecting them. Yeah, they were both gay. They both hang out in the French Quarter, but they never knew each other. And that's only one of 100 different connections that they have. So let's get into this real quickly. We're going to start off by talking about Schlumberger because Schlumberger was a major event that most people still don't understand. Schlumberger was a well drilling corporation. It was owned by a guy named Jean de Menil. Jean de Menil was a member of CMC Permindex that we talked about earlier. And in 1961 or 62, before the assassination, you've got David Ferry and Sergio Arcacha Smith, Gordon Novell, and Leighton Martins. And I think 1 or 2 other miscellaneous guys who aren't really important. They allegedly broke into a munitions bunker in Houma, Louisiana. And it was owned by the Schlumberger Well Company. But when you start to dig into the relationships here, you'll find that besides both being members of Permindex, Clay Shaw and Jean de Menil, you will find that Jean de Menil had a relationship with the CIA ongoing. He also had a relationship with the Mossad. He heavily funded Mossad activities. They say he was a Roman Catholic. Highly doubt it. Probably another crypto Jew. But In 1962, you've got David Ferrie, Sergio Arcacha, Gordon Novell, and these guys breaking into Schlumberger. And when they got caught, they basically said, this was years after the fact, they basically said that the CIA left the door open for them to take the weapons, okay? So what you have is a arms depot being run by a well drilling corporation, right? Why does a well drilling corporation need all these arms? They don't. They belong to the CIA. And so what was really going on here, the cover story, is that they were smuggling all of these weapons to the anti-Castro Cubans, right? They needed to take out Castro. The anti-Castro Cubans were getting all this money. They're getting all these weapons. And I think that is complete and blatant bullshit. If that is the case, where was the Cuban people's uprising? It never happened. Where did those weapons go? They disappear off the face of the earth. Where did all the millions of dollars in funding that allegedly went to go fuel these organizations, where did that end up? Well, I'll tell you what, it sure as shit did not end up in Cuba. We'll get to that momentarily. But I wanted to talk about the relationship between CIA and Schlumberger to kind of show that what David Ferrie said was correct, or what Gordon Novell said was correct. Garrison is charged that Gordon Novell, Sergio Arcacha Smith, and others robbed a munitions bunker at Houma, Louisiana. Gordon Novell has stated that the munitions bunker belonged to the Schlumberger Corporation and that he and others removed the contents of the bunker in August 61 at the instigation of the CIA. Now, and the CIA's response to that is the New Orleans office of the DCS had one contact with Charles A. Doe, manager of Schlumberger office in New Orleans in June of 1955. There had been occasional but circumspect contact with the main Schlumberger office in Houston for an extended but unspecified period. Such contact continues. Okay, so the CIA and Schlumberger had an ongoing relationship, which just backs the statements made by Gordon Novell that they left the door open for them.
I'm always surprised to hear how much New Orleans and Louisiana in general was involved with the JFK assassination. We were in the heart of it for a little while.
Yeah, we Chris and I actually went to this bunker and took some pictures. It was actually really cool. All right, so fundamentally, the funneling of money and arms to anti-Castro Cubans was a front. Castro was a longstanding CIA partner and was a willing participant in the smuggling of arms, drugs, and people to Israel. This was nothing more than a continuation of the Sonborn Institute, the well-documented smuggling operation established by Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion. So in 1945, David Ben-Gurion, because there was an arms embargo against the Middle East, including Israel, they weren't about to pour weapons into the Middle East on one side or the other, because then we would be dragged in as opposition, and they weren't having it. Okay, they just got out of one war; they weren't about to start another one. So this is what the CIA do. The CIA assisted the Israelis, David Ben-Gurion, the man ultimately behind the assassination. He comes to the United States, and what does he do? In a hotel in New York City, he sets up the Sonborn Institute using Rudolf Sonborn, who was a very wealthy Jewish entrepreneur here in the United States and funder of Israel. And basically, for over 20 years, who the hell knows? It probably never stopped. What they did was they would break into these bunkers and these army bases and all kinds of places. There was a big one in Hawaii where they stole a whole bunch of arms and people got killed, and it was all crazy. But basically, these fucking goddamn Zionists, they didn't take no for an answer. They came here and they just stole all of our World War II surplus and shipped it back over to fucking Israel. And all of these, in Kennedy, when you read about these, the Houma bunker and all these, this total of 3 or 4 bunkers that were broken into by these guys and all the arms stolen. And it was, the cover was that it was being shipped to the anti-Castro Cubans. It's a fucking lie. These weapons and money made their way back to Israel under the guise of the Sonborn Institute. That is fucking reality. And you're not going to hear anybody else ever tell you that. So what exactly was Fidel Castro's relationship with Israel at the time? Well, the bottom line is that he was in their pocket. They offer all kinds of stuff, money, food, education. I mean, these guys are economic hitmen. They come in, they make you all kinds of favors, and then they own you, until he actually intentionally severed the relationship with Israel in the 1970s. Why? Because he learned they're fucking cunts, because they always are. So Fidel Castro's complicated relationship with Jews in the state of Israel. In 1960, a Jewish German by the name of Richard Wolff, who had helped Castro overthrow previous Cuban dictator Batista, was appointed Cuban envoy to Israel. In the period during which Wolff served in Israel, agricultural exports from the kibbutz movement, okay, the kibbutz movement was co-founded by Reuven Daphne, who in 1946 met with Bugsy Siegel and established the relationship between the U.S. Mafia and the Haganah, or the Israelis, you could say, in general. So basically, you have the same organization here, the kibbutz movement. They were sent to Cuba with the involvement of the Israeli Foreign Ministry under the cover of an Israeli-Cuban Relations Association, all right? So in 1960-61, through the assassination, the Cubans were working covertly with Israel, okay? But you're going to tell me that the fucking CIA is trying to overthrow Castro while they have a positive relationship with Israel, right? They are basically the same organization, the CIA and the Mossad. And then you've got the Mossad working with the Cubans. No, this is what was really going on. You have the CIA and Castro with a false conflict to justify spending. That's what all the fuck that was, okay? That's why. You think they couldn't knock off this guy on this island 90 miles off the fucking coast? Give me a break. Give me a break. It's ridiculous. Okay, it's a false conflict to justify spending. The CIA and Israel had a solid relationship. Israel and Castro had a solid relationship. And then you have the Sonborn Institute, the smuggling of weapons to Israel, which Jack Ruby was a key part of. Okay, he got busted in 1940 something down in Miami, and his name was removed from the indictment. All right. But he was part of the Sonborn Institute and the smuggling of people and guns and drugs to Israel. All right. He had a buddy in Galveston named Robert McEwen. Robert McEwen is the guy in the picture here with Castro in the middle. Him and Castro were drinking buddies, right? Robert McEwen and Castro were good friends. And so this just kind of completes the loop here, right? Castro and McEwen had met several times, and Jack Ruby was involved in deals that McEwen ultimately closed on behalf of the mafia with Fidel Castro to ship Jeeps down there and all kinds of stuff. But all of the deals they made weren't for Fidel Castro. All those arms and munitions made their fucking way over to the Middle East to Israel. That's reality. And I will debate anybody on this point anytime. And of course, no one ever wants to take me up on any of that. All right. So now we're gonna get back to, did David Ferry know Clay Shaw? And I'm just going to read off some of the documents here. U.S. District Court pleadings in which certain witnesses are referred to, as well as the circumstances under which they saw Shaw and Ferry together. Betty Rubio, who saw them together at Lakefront Airport. Mr. and Mrs. Nicholas Tadin, who saw them together at Lakefront Airport. Herbert Wagner, who apparently saw them together at Ferry Service Station. Jim Louver, who saw them together at Ferry Service Station and at Ferry's house. And James Laurent, who saw them together at Ferry Service Station in 1964. Also mentioned in the pleadings are William Dunn, who saw Shaw and Ferry with Lee Oswald at Clinton, Town Marshal John Manchester, who identified Shaw and Ferry as the occupants of the International Trademarks limousine at Clinton, Henry Earl Palmer, who saw Lee Oswald at the Clinton registration office and who identified Shaw and Ferry as similar to the two men in the black ITM Cadillac parked there, and Corey Collins, who saw Shaw and Ferry and Oswald drive up together in the car. The latter group were among those whose testimony about seeing Shaw and Ferry together is a matter of record in the Shaw trial. So you've got the statements by Nicholas Tadin and his wife, which I'll go over more in detail here in a minute. And then you have statements and memos of Shaw being flown with White of Freeport Nickel Company. That's actually George White. George White had his, he was on the outskirts of the assassination too. A subsidiary of Freeport Sulfur. See, okay, one of these things with Permindex and CMC is like when you go through their documents, you see all the companies they invested in. Every single damn company they invested in played a role in the building of Dimona. Okay, Freeport nickel, and they needed nickel to be used in the nuclear reactor. Okay, so all these companies that are connected to CMC and Permindex, the only purpose they had was to acquire parts for the nuclear reactor in Dimona. That is it. Okay, that's it. Nobody else wants to admit that. Okay, so this is from Littman's book. There was one last gasp in the trial after the Warren Commission rehash was over. Garrison called Nicholas Tadin and his wife Matilda to the stand. They had just come forward that very day with their story. They testified that their oldest son, who was 16 in 1964, took flying lessons from David Ferry. He was deaf, which makes the story unlikely, but there was no time for defense to check this out. And I just want to pause right there because there's a Deaf Pilots Association, all right? So not only is this guy a shitty researcher, he's just a dick. They claim to have. Do you have something to say?
No, I was just laughing.
Okay. They claim to have seen Ferry at the airport with Clay Shaw. Mrs. Tadin told the court the following. Now, it's very important what he quotes here. Mrs. Tadin, so I can explain myself. We were out there and we were waiting for Dave to come, and he was heading towards us, and I noticed a gentleman with Dave, and I passed the comment to my husband. That was a distinguished-looking man with Dave, and my husband said, "Oh, look, who was with Dave?" Later, she said just one thing she remembered that was just a distinguished-looking person, but her statement that morning in the DA's office was slightly different. Her statement to the DA's office says, "My husband and I had gone out to New Orleans Airport one afternoon sometime in the summer of '64. While waiting to see David Ferry, we saw him come out of the hangar with another person. My husband turned to me and said, 'Look who's with Dave.' And I said, 'Who's that?' My husband told me that the man was Clay Shaw, a notorious degenerate," right? So he cherry picks it. Then he points out the document, which shows he cherry picks it. And let me go show you how he cherry picks it some more. This is the actual quote from the Clay Shaw trial. So I'm going to show you how he decided to leave out the most important parts of her statement. just to make his own irrational point. So Mrs. Tadin, I'm going to show you a picture of which I've identified for the purposes of stage 3 and ask you if you recognize the man in the picture. David Ferry. Is that the man giving your son instructions in flying? Yes. While your son was taking these lessons, did you have occasion to see David Ferry very often? I made it my business to be out there practically every afternoon at the time he took a lesson. Where would he take his lesson? The New Orleans airport, the lakefront airport? Yes, sir. Now, Mrs. Tadin, in the summer of 64, did you have occasion to be at the lakefront airport with your husband and your son at the time when he was to take a lesson? Yes. On this occasion, Mrs. Tadin, did you have occasion to see this man I am pointing to, indicating Defendant Shaw? Yes, I did. Okay, so he leaves out this whole part about where Mrs. Tadin, to Clay Shaw's face, identified him as the man that she saw with David Ferry in 64. See, so he just cherry picked what he wanted to present and said, see, this is what she said. But no, he took what she said and he butchered it to support his own purpose. So Mrs. Tadin, can you approximate when that was? What month? It was the summer of 64, the latter part of the summer. I'm sorry, go ahead. So I can explain myself. We were out there and we were waiting for Dave to come and he was heading towards us and I noticed a gentleman with Dave and I passed the comment to my husband that it was a distinguished looking man with Dave and my husband said, oh, look, who is with Dave? I object, Your Honor. That's Clay Shaw's lawyer objecting. The court, your husband made a reply and what did you do as a result of what he told you? And then by Mr. Alcock, who is the Dave you were referring to? David Ferry. And who is the man you said was with David Ferry? Is that the man you identified just now? Yes. So twice in her testimony, she identifies Clay Shaw, the man sitting in the courtroom, as the man who was with David Ferry. So once again, Mr. Litwin has failed, and he failed in this case due to his own attempts at disinformation and not telling you and lying through omission. So I have a whole bunch of these here that talk about people who saw Clay Shaw and who saw David Ferry together. This one I thought was really good and convincing. Statement of Mrs. June Rolfe to the effect that in the early 1960s, she observed Clay Shaw in a light-colored Thunderbird convertible with the top down. There were two young men in the front seat with Shaw and David Ferry, whom she recalls because of his strange makeup job hair was in the back seat, right? So number one, she points out a Thunderbird convertible. Number two, she doesn't know who Dave is, but she says he's got a makeup job. That one's pretty obvious because he used to paint on his face and paint on his eyebrows and all that crap. And this I thought was really good because she got the kind of car right. So Clay Shaw had registered to him for 5 years, a 59 Thunderbird convertible, right? So, you know, Mr. Litwin did not mention this. I have a bunch of more statements that Mr. Litwin completely overlooked and failed to mention. Here's one. For some time, I've been trying to locate Guy Bannister's files, which were picked clean after his death by Delphine Roberts, who was first on scene. Mrs. Mary Bannister and the FBI. Ross Bannister told me that Major Wiley of the Louisiana State Police obtained some of the Bannister files from Mary Bannister. He also said that an ex-FBI agent was helping Mary Bannister dispose of or sell the files. Damn, I'd love to have those files. Also, Joe Cooper of Baton Rouge said that he had heard Bannister had a file on Lee Harvey Oswald and Clay Shaw, which went to Major Wiley of the Louisiana State Police. Bannister did have a folder on Clay Shaw and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, but both folders are empty. I have seen these empty folders in the office of the State Sovereignty Commission in Baton Rouge. Okay, so yeah, so Clay Shaw was all kinds of deep in intelligence, all kinds of connections to him. He was in Bannister's office. Here's another lead called the Illinois lead from a guy named Henry Lesnick, who's in the Department of English at Northwestern University. He has written me and stated that a friend of his who lived in New Orleans for 18 months in 61 and 62 has admitted that he was Clay Shaw's lover intermittently during that period. The friend of Lesnick's also stated that David Ferry was Shaw's lover as well. The friend stated that he met them early in 61 at a party, which they attended together, right? So you got all kinds of people coming out of the woodwork putting these guys together. The Moret lead, okay, this is a good one. This is Oswald's aunt. Last year, Mark Lane interviewed the Moret family, Oswald's aunt, and learned that a few days after Lee had left New Orleans, which is to say a few days after September 24th, 63, two men appeared at the Moret home to ask where Lee was. One of them was described by Mrs. Moret as a tall, well-dressed, gray-haired man. When shown a number of photographs by Mark Lane, who conducted the questioning, Mrs. Moret picked out a picture of Shaw as one of the two men. My recollection is that this was a distinct identification in the sense that she was not hesitant about selecting the picture, but that intended to follow it up by bringing her to court so she can see him. Then you have the Morgan Shreveport phone number. Okay, so you got David Ferrie and Clay Shaw calling the same person, a guy named Robert Morgan. Robert Morgan, extremely crucial in the assassination. I have not been able to figure out how, but he was good friends with Jack Valente as well. Then when you go through Clay Shaw's notebook, for a guy who didn't know David Ferrie, he has Leighton Martin's name, address in here. There are other notes about Leighton Martin's in his notebooks. He admits that Clay Shaw admitted he knew Leighton Martin's and they met in 1965. However, Leighton Martin's, if you know anything about Leighton Martin's, him and David Ferrie were glued at the hip. Okay. And so the odds of Clay Shaw having been friends with Leighton Martin's and not knowing David Ferrie, slim none. This is just more on the Freeport Sulfur Company. This is the best one I found. Blank advised this date that Aura Lee, Clay Shaw's former secretary at the International Trade Mart in New Orleans, who was employed by the Heart Fund at the Ochsner Clinic, stated in front of Dr. Charles Moore and others at Ochsner Hospital 31 last, after Shaw's press conference where he advised he never met David Ferrie, that she had seen Ferrie go into Shaw's office in the International Trade Mart building on a number of occasions and believed Ferrie had privileged entry into Shaw's office. Okay, so this is Shaw's secretary putting David Ferrie in his office. Okay, it doesn't get any better than that. All right. So another thing that he says is that David Ferrie was not in Dallas. Of course, David Ferrie was in Dallas. Why the hell do you think David Ferrie is so important in the assassination? Why does his name come up every time people talk about the assassination? Because he was one of the assassins. Okay. So on December 13, 1966, Garrison recorded an interview with Jack Martin and Pershing Gervais, his former chief investigator. Martin said that Ferrie was in Dallas, at least in Fort Worth, 2 days before the assassination of President Kennedy. He further went claiming, I understand he was to fly 3 people from there to Laredo, Texas, either there or Matamoros, Mexico. This is not true. Ferrie was not in Dallas. Well, yes, he was. So this convinced Garrison that Ferrie's ice skating trip was perhaps something much bigger. Might he have been Oswald's getaway pilot? Richard Billings wrote that Garrison now believes that Ferrie was a transportation manager in the conspiracy. He was in charge of getting the conspirators in and out of Dallas. Garrison knew that Ferrie had gone to Houston, not Dallas, and thus he believes Ferrie did not actually fly them himself, but knows how it was handled and where the getaway plane is now. Yeah, that is nonsense. David Ferrie was absolutely crucial in organization of the plot from many different fronts, and we're going to have to talk about that at Forbidden Knowledge News Con. This is the actual document including statements from Jack Martin, where Jack Martin puts him in Dallas 2 days before the assassination, puts him in Fort Worth. And remember, Jack Martin is not really Jack Martin. This Jack Martin at the time is Jean-Pierre Lafitte, not Edward Suggs. That's a complicated one. Okay, so that's David Ferrie leaning against a tree in the background. Okay, if you want to know how I know that's David Ferrie, you are going to have to wait until April the 3rd when I do my epic presentation on the totality of the assassination at Forbidden Knowledge NewsCon.
What do you think? That's going to take about 6 hours or so?
God damn, it's going to be at least 4. I might even have to have an intermission or something, but no, it's going to be at least 4 because what I'm doing is I'm going to go over all the absolutely relevant incidents leading up to the assassination. It's going to be a couple leading up to, but then I'm going to go from the minute that the trigger was pulled, what happened over the next 72 hours. And it's going to be slam dunk proof that who the shooters were, how they were, where they went, this and that, the Galveston trip, the whole 9 yards. And it's going to conclude probably with Jack Ruby shooting Oswald. So it's going to be epic. 300 plus slides, figure a minute a slide. So that's David Ferrie leaning against a tree in the background. Okay. He's then seen behind the book depository. He's identified by his eyebrows, which were described as overbearing. And he was driving Carl Mather's blue over gray Plymouth, which is then seen at the Tippit shooting, right? So you got David Ferrie as one of the shooters behind the fence. He's identified by his clothing. By Ed Hoffman, the deaf mute, which matches the description of the witness behind the book depository, which matches the description of the witnesses over at the Tippit shooting, and the gray Plymouth driven owned by Carl Mathers was seen behind the book depository and at the Tippit shooting. Hello, duh, not rocket science. David Ferrie was a shooter, and he was a shooter of Tippit. All right, more evidence that David Ferry was in Dealey Plaza. This is Leighton Martins and Alvin Beaubouf down in Dealey Plaza. And if you don't believe me, you don't have to. I got an 84% facial recognition match for Alvin Beaubouf. And that's clear as day, Leighton Martin standing next to him, okay? Allegedly, David Ferry had gone to Houston and Galveston to go ice skating and all this other crap with a guy named Melvin Coffee. Melvin Coffee is another one of these aliases. That Melvin Coffee, there is a real Melvin Coffee, but that name was also used as an alias by Leighton Martins and by Michael Payne. Okay, so these guys share aliases of real people, so you never know who was really where. Okay, now we're going to get into what David Ferry really actually did. So this is a document from the Garrison files. It says, check the Daily Star, Hammond, Louisiana. Supposedly a graduate student, presumed Southeastern, says Ferry hid out the night of the assassination in a dorm in Hammond. There is an airport in Hammond, also the home of Shaw's mother. Athletic director Grady Martin might have some info. Okay, I dug high and low for athletic director Grady Martin. There is not a word about him anywhere. This is the only reference to it in the entire documents for the Kennedy assassination. So when I tried pulling information on who he really was, if he's still alive, of course he's not alive. And that is just another one of those important leads that will end up going nowhere. So who does David Ferry know in Hammond, Louisiana? He knows a guy named Thomas Compton. This is Compton's statement to the authorities. Mr. Compton continued to state that on Sunday after the assassination, 5:30 a.m., he was awakened by David Ferry in his dormitory bed at the University of Southeastern in Hammond, Louisiana. Mr. Compton stated that until this day, he is uncertain how David Ferry located him on this date. At this time, Dave Ferry was in hysterics and near tears. He stated that the police are at my home and they've taken some of my things. Compton stated that David Ferry did not elaborate on my things and stated that Ferry also related that he didn't do anything wrong. The two talked for a while on different unrelated subjects, and then Ferry made 2 calls to New Orleans, and Compton believed they were to G. Ray Gill, attorney at law, was Marcello's lawyer. And Compton stated that Dave Ferry left the apartment. He left at approximately 8:30 a.m. the same morning. He's believed he returned to New Orleans in a Ford Falcon. This Ford Falcon is extremely important, but you're going to have to wait till April to hear about that. He left in a Ford Falcon station wagon painted light blue. Compton stated that David Ferry did not tell him he had been to Texas. Compton stated he had never met Lee Harvey Oswald, and also that he could not connect him in any way to the CAP. Only knowledge of Oswald was from Mr. Bill Wolfe, who headed the New Orleans Astronomers Club, and that's a whole nother ball of wax. All right, so the next statement I have actually is from Thomas Compton's roommate. Thomas Compton's roommate, here, I'll go ahead and read this to you. In the fall of 1963, my roommate was Thomas Compton. We were residing in Holloway Smith Hall, Southeastern Louisiana College. I think that on approximately November 22nd or 23rd, he told me that a friend of his would be staying in our room. The reason for this person staying was said to be that so he could be where many people could see him. I was told his name was Dave. I don't remember for certain whether I was ever told his last name. I was told that he was a psychologist. Now, in the upper right here, I have a little clip that I got from the white pages, right? In 1963, David Ferry was listed as a psychologist in the New Orleans white paper, in the white pages. Okay, so on the 23rd of November in the afternoon, or perhaps the evening, I went to my room and found the man sleeping in my roommate's bed. His back was to me so that I couldn't see his face at the time. I noticed, however, that he was sleeping fully clothed and with his hat on. At this time, I also noticed that his hair was very strange looking. I believe that I was introduced to him later on in the evening, but I don't remember the nature of the introduction or what was said, except that not much was said at all. I asked my roommate about this man, in particular about his hair. I was told that he was bald and that he had pasted theatrical hair at the point where the hat met his head. I am not certain that he spent the entire night in the room or that he spent more than a few hours in the early evening. The next time I saw him was Sunday morning. Okay, note this, Sunday morning in the lobby of the dormitory. This is the important part. It was very crowded as everyone was watching the funeral on television. Okay, everyone was watching the funeral. The only problem is the funeral was Monday morning, not Sunday morning. I believe I saw him any more after Sunday morning. Later that day, my roommate told me that he'd gone back home. I don't know how he got there. Perhaps my roommate drove him. Okay, so this is what we actually have for David Ferry's movements. We have David Ferry in Fort Worth on November 20th, as per Jack Martin. We have Ferry in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. He was a shooter on the knoll, and he was a second tippet shooter, and that is where Mr. Litwin got it dead wrong. Ferry then hid out in Hammond the night of November 22nd, as per the Garrison memo. Frank Chalona sees Ferry sleeping on Saturday, November 23rd, 63 in the afternoon or evening in Hammond. And this is crucial because this confirms Ferry never went to Houston. He never went to the Winterland. He was hiding out in Hammond, Louisiana, and Bill Dalzell went to the Winterland, okay? So anything you've ever heard about David Ferry going ice skating, complete disinformation bullshit. All right, and so then you got Thomas Compton puts Ferry in Hammond at 5:30 a.m. Sunday until 8:30, and then Chelona puts Ferry in Hammond on 11:25 in the morning during Kennedy's funeral. So basically, David Ferry gets there the night of the assassination, Friday night. He hides out there all weekend and dips out Monday morning. That is what he did. Okay. Anything else that people try to push is bullshit. And why do I have to be the only goddamn person on the fucking planet to figure this out? This is where I really get to really start to getting angry, because this is shit that has delayed the solving of the assassination for 50 fucking years. Okay. This shit was not hard. This was not hard. Some other fucking asshole should have solved this 50 years ago. And that's what pisses me off about my research, is that I shouldn't have to be researching. This should have already been done 50 fucking years ago, but it wasn't, because researchers are fucking lazy or they work for the government. God, I fucking hate them.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the latter. I mean, there's so much disinformation out there, intentionally put out there.
Yeah. Except for Ted Rubenstein. I got to say, except for investigator Ted Rubenstein. I like Ted. He's become a friend of mine. So you hear that, Ted? Because I know he's going to hear that at some point. So, but yeah, this is just bullshit. Okay. So Chelona puts him in Hammond on Monday, and Ferry's back in New Orleans meeting with Garrison on the 25th, right? So Jack Martin rats out fucking David Ferry to Garrison, and Garrison gets him in there the day after he gets back from his trip to Dallas. It's really hilarious. I mean, I think it's kind of funny because Garrison didn't know anything until 67, right? This was all nothing until he actually started working on the case. All right, so and then here's some more points. At about midnight, November 24th, 63, officers R. Comstock, L. Ivan J. C. Jeannot, and whoever the fuck that is, the point of this memo is basically they got together, started their investigation because of the word of Jack Martin on or about midnight on the 24th, okay? Then with this information, shortly after midnight, these officers went to 3330 Louisiana Avenue, which is Ferry's place, knocked on the door. There they encountered Alvin Beaubouf and Leighton Martins, okay? They did a search. They found a whole bunch of stuff. They found a box of pubic hairs, a whole bunch of weird shit, bunch of weapons, grenades, the whole nine yards. And then they take those two guys into custody. So, but the problem is, you've got David Ferry, Alvin Beaubouf, and Melvin Coffey, right, allegedly, checking out of the hotel in Houston, checking out of the Alamo Motel at around 8 or 9 o'clock on the 23rd, okay? It's a 6-hour drive from Houston to New Orleans. How the fuck did they check out 8 or 9 o'clock, and yet they're sitting there without David Ferry just after midnight? Because this timeline, this person, whoever that is, that left around the hotel around 8 or 9 o'clock that night, okay? They ended up going back to Dallas because that was part of the swaparoo that happened on the Galveston trip. And if you want to know the details of that, you're going to have to wait until April when I give my next presentation. But yeah, it was not them who were at the hotel because they could not have made it from Houston to New Orleans in 3 hours, plain and simple. They were there because they were already there because they checked out of Galveston 10 o'clock in the morning, drove back to New Orleans, and were probably chilling there all day while David Ferry was still up in Hammond. All right, so that being the case, we're going to talk about the Winterland Ice Arena, and I know I've already talked about the Winterland Ice Arena, but it's the single most important aspect of the assassination in as far as what I needed to solve the assassination, right? This is the key, the Winterland Ice Arena. Once again, more things that I've discovered that I shouldn't have discovered because some other schmuck should have discovered it. But we're going to talk about the Winterland Ice Arena. So allegedly, the assassination happens, and then David Ferry allegedly hops in a car, you know, just some conflicting information on what he did after the assassination. Allegedly, he's seen in New Orleans by Alice Gidros, who's G. Ray Gill's secretary, says she saw him there about 12 o'clock, said he was heading out for lunch, he'd be back, never came back. Then you have him at a celebration party for Carlos Marcello around 5, 6 o'clock in the evening because Marcello was on trial. He got not guilty that day. And supposedly that's where David Ferry was. And then he didn't end up leaving New Orleans until 9 o'clock at night. And then he arrives in Houston at, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And that's allegedly how that went. It is all fiction. So allegedly Ferry on the 23rd, remember now you have Frank Chelona's statements that Ferry was sleeping in his bed on the 23rd in the afternoon and the evening, right? So it was not David Ferry at the Winterland. It was Bill Dalzell. I'll have to explain his whole role a whole nother time. But basically, I'm going to refer to him as Ferry just for simplicity. And Ferry allegedly meets with Chuck Rowland at the Winterland. First thing that tripped me off here was that nobody's named Roland Roland. If you did, you should kill your parents because they hate you. And His real name is Roland Chuck Roland, okay? He's half Korean, half French-Canadian. He was a professional ice skater. And why no one else has pointed out his name was really Roland, I'm really not sure. So this is the Winterland Ice. The real name is the Winterland Ice Arena. People call it the Winterland Ice Rink. The official name was the Winterland Ice Arena. These are pictures of it. And this is Mary Boots Roberts and Ronnie Roberts. And so the Winterland Ice Arena was actually run by Mary Boots Roberts and Ronnie Roberts. And as we go through this data here, if you've never seen this before, Mary Boots Roberts, well, she worked for the CIA. So Mary Boots Roberts White, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to read her parts of her obituary to you, because this is like some of the most significant stuff. And this was like, without this right here, this one obituary, man, it blew my mind. It turned me on to so many things. And this was like one of the things that helped me solve the assassination. Mary Boots Roberts White passed away on Saturday, the 29th of November. Beloved mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother and friend. She accomplished much in her life. She became a professional ice skater, and she worked for NASA. Okay? Keep that in mind. During the Apollo and Gemini missions, she owned several businesses and became an inspiration to many. She is preceded in death by her parents, Joe and Corinne Caltagirone, brother Joe Caltagirone Jr. All right, so this is the good stuff. Now, anybody in the Kennedy assassination who you heard went and worked for NASA did not go work for NASA. Okay, that NASA operated as a front for intelligence in the 1950s and the 1960s. Okay, so when you had your $400 wrench that NASA needed, it really didn't cost $400. That money went to the CIA covertly. NASA has a long history of working with intelligence.
Now, when you were saying earlier how there's only a few people involved at the top, but when you look at the grand scope of it, it's so compartmentalized and so massive, so widespread, so many people involved. It's kind of mind-blowing how you were able to uncover this information with it being, you know, so vast. And I just think a lot of researchers don't go down the same rabbit holes that you do.
Well, I was a cop for 9 years. You know, I had to try to make cases based on going through, you know, people's public Facebook data and stuff. You know what I mean? Like, I learned how to correlate relationships. And so a lot of the stuff that I learned how to do really wasn't even really, I mean, I'm really hard on the old JFK researchers, you know, because I have a thing about stupid people. And so the bottom line is, like, a lot of the shit, like, would never have been figured out if it wasn't for, number one, Trump's last document dump on JFK. It was fucking priceless. Anyone who says anything otherwise is a moron. And number two is that the birth of the internet and social media has allowed for this, like, resurgence in interest in, like, history. So some of the information that I found, which I'll show you here in a little bit, came from, like, forums that had nothing to do with Kennedy. Right. So to find information on the Winterland, I went to, like, a Houston Historical Society forum, you know, that had like 300 members on the forum. And I just read about, hey, you guys remember the Winterland? I used to ice skate there. Who used to own that place? You know, right? And then people just start talking on forums. That was not possible prior to the digital age. Right. So, I mean, I'm really hard on these guys who are former or past Kennedy researchers, but they didn't have the tools to get the shit done. If it wasn't for the internet, this would be impossible. You know, you'd have to be going to Houston to pull records. And that's like, that's one of my regrets when we were in New Orleans. I didn't get to Houston, but, like, man, I'm gonna have to buy a place in Houston, because there's so many goddamn documents that I need to pull that will back everything I'm saying with the original records and lead to even more things, right? So, but yeah, this information didn't come out until the birth of the internet and the digital age and all this crap. So it's hard for me to, like, hold this, you know, in good conscience, you know, slander some of these old researchers. But yeah, so now the thing about Mary Caltagirone is that she has a cousin named Vincent Caltagirone Jr. Vincent Caltagirone Jr., in my opinion, one of the most important people in the assassination by far. Very important person in American history. No one's ever heard of this guy. If it wasn't for me, there would be no information on this guy. No one's ever written about this guy before. He's been a nobody until I discovered him. And the really important thing about him is that he has a son named Tom Caltagirone, who has a wife named Lou Caltagirone. He also has a son named Jack Caltagirone, right? So who else has a son named Tom and a wife named Lou? Who else? Who's the mother of his children, and why is she significant? Well, it turns out that the mother of his children is Lorraine Valenti, who went on to be Lorraine Valenti Dinerstein. That is the sister of Jack Valenti. Okay, so Jack Valenti, who I've already talked about in excruciating detail in the past and will continue to do so, Jack Valenti was the quintessential shooter on the grassy knoll. He was also involved in the Martin Luther King assassination and a whole bunch of other stuff for the CIA. He was a lifelong CIA operative. And when people talk about Malcolm Wallace being LBJ's personal hitman, I disagree. I have evidence that Jack Valenti was actually Lyndon Johnson's personal hitman. So, but why is that important? So you have Vincent Calderon, right, who's married to Lorraine Valenti, who is the sister of Jack Valenti. And then Jack Valenti was the right-hand man of Lyndon Johnson for a decade. Okay, starting in 1955 through 1966, he was Lyndon Johnson's not only right-hand man, but sexual plaything. We will talk about Valenti. Honestly, for the Valenti stuff, you're going to have to wait for my fucking book. I got way too much. So, but the bottom line is that Vincent, this is more proof that Vincent was married to Lorraine, and this is from the Jack Valenti FBI files, right? So they write Vincent in the corner here, and that kind of helped me put the connection together there. This is Joyce Rowland, okay? Joyce Rowland was allegedly the mother of Richard Rowland and was allegedly married to Roulant Rowland, right? And so this is from a Facebook group that I had gotten into, Richard Rowland posted this, and he said, "This is my mom, Joyce Rowland. I saw some previous posts where there were questions about who owned the Winterland Ice Rink. Her recollection is that the Johnson family built the building at the rink. They owned the multi-story building across the street that fronted Kirby and other real estate throughout Houston. Their motivation was from Ronnie and Boots Roberts. Ronnie and Boots owned or managed the ice skating studio in the center where the Western Kitchen was. It was from there they talked to the Johnsons about building a full-size rink. Something didn't go well with the Roberts, and this is where he's lying. Something didn't go well with the Roberts, and my parents, Joyce and Chuck Rowland, became the tenants of the building. That's a total fabrication, and I'll show you here why momentarily." So this is what we have here. We've got Lyndon Johnson owns the building, right? So Lyndon Johnson, Johnson Family Enterprise, owns the Winterland Ice Rink. The Winterland Ice Rink was leased then to Mary Calderon, who was Mary Boots Roberts White, and her cousin was Vincent Calderon Jr., okay? Vincent Calderon Jr. is, by this point, divorced in 61 from Lorraine Valenti. And Lorraine Valenti is the sister of Jack Valenti, who is then the right-hand man of Lyndon Johnson, right? So this is a closed loop of interaction between these guys, between Lyndon Johnson, Mary Calderon, Vincent Calderon, and Jack Valenti. Extremely, extremely important. It just goes to basically prove that this was a CIA front the whole time. And so this is extremely important, okay? So this, I don't know why it was never identified, but there was one local call made from the hotel, right? So basically what you have is David Ferry says that he goes to the Winterland, but he really wasn't him, as we've already demonstrated. But they stayed at a place called the Alum Motel. And from the Alum Motel, they called this number, MO 4-3581. Okay, so nobody had ever figured out what that number was. I think Garrison made a mention to it, but he wasn't really sure. Well, it turns out that number is to the Gateway Swim and Skate. The Gateway Swim and Skate, when you talk to David Ferry, when you look at what David Ferry said in regards to his activities in Houston, he said that he went to a couple skating rinks because he was thinking about opening one himself. It was a total lie. He said that he went to the Bel Air skating rink. Well, the Bel Air skating rink was actually demolished in 1959, and then the Gateway Swim and Skate was built where the Bel Air skating rink used to be. So it's very important because, number one, it indicates that David Ferry had been hanging with these guys, making runs to Houston and going to the Bel Air skating rink, obviously since 59. So here it is in 1963. He doesn't know that the Gateway has been changed to the Bel Air. Yeah, bullshit. Okay, he wasn't on the trip is why he got all those questions wrong. So this I thought was great. So this is a perfect example of how I do my research and where I get some of my information from people who were really there, right? So this is a post from 2011. The Gateway Pool opened in 1959. I was 10 at the time. They had this huge grand opening, and my parents bought me a season pass. Our house backed up close to it. I would ride my bike through the vacant lot next to our house, and it was just on the other side of the Alamo Motel. Okay, this is crucial because that goes to show that the number they were calling was to the Gateway. They went and stayed at the Alamo Hotel, which backed up to the Gateway. Why the hell would they be doing this? What is so important about this goddamn Gateway, right? Well, when you go back to Vincent Calderon's obituary and you start reading through his obituary, it turns out that this guy taught scuba at the downtown Houston YMCA. So we'll get to why Vincent Calderon is so important here in a second, but I'm just showing you the relationship here, right? So they're calling the Gateway. They stay at the Alamo Hotel, which backs up to the Gateway. And it turns out that Vincent Caltagirone taught scuba at the downtown Houston YMCA. Well, guess what? The Gateway is what was later rebranded the downtown Houston YMCA. Okay. So obviously Vincent Caltagirone was working there. They were trying to get a hold of him. That is why they went to the Alamo Hotel. That is why they were trying to call the Gateway, to try to get a hold of Vincent Caltagirone. Why would they try to get a hold of Vincent Caltagirone? Well, because Vincent Caltagirone was a short tramp. Okay. Vincent Caltagirone, I've done a ton of presentations on Jack Valente and Vincent Caltagirone, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more later on, but Vincent Caltagirone was the short tramp. He was also Raoul. And this is Joyce Rowland and Mary Boots Roberts. When you put their pictures next to each other, they're the same goddamn person. And to verify that, I got an 80% on a facial recognition match. You can see the facial recognition match is in green. When it is not a match, you get them in red. And trust me, I've only had 3 actual identifications through facial recognition. This is one of the 3. Mary Boots Roberts and Joyce Rowland are the same goddamn person. So basically the Winterland was a CIA front. David Ferrie never went there. He went there to establish an alibi, right? But they went to a place to establish an alibi that was run by the fucking CIA, right? And I guess they were counting on the fact that no one would ever uncover that fact. So that is it for the Winterland. Now let's talk about, was Oswald a communist? This one is really short and sweet. This one I didn't even really have to go into a lot of detail with. This is the easiest one of them all. So I'm going to read from Fred Littman's book. Oswald's interest now turned to Cuba and Fidel Castro. He started with New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. When interviewed on the radio, Bill Stuckey, he said that you cannot say Castro was a communist at this time because he has not developed his country, his system thus far. He has not had a chance to become a communist. He is an experimenter, a person who is trying to find out the best way for his country. Oswald saw Cuba as a chance for that pure communistic society, and he wanted to play a part and influence Castro in the revolution. Oswald even had a picture of Castro on the mantelpiece in his apartment. This is fucking hilarious, okay? So everyone says the proof that he was a communist was that he was with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and he was hanging out these things, and he went on, he said he was a communist, right? Just believe him, right? That's hilarious. So this is who founded the Fair Play for Cuba Committee: Richard Gibson and Robert Tabor. These guys worked for CBS in the 1950s, and they worked for the CIA. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee was a CIA front the entire time. This is a great article from Newsweek. I call it Fair Play for CIA Committee. I'll read this to you. Born in 1931, Gibson grew up in Philadelphia and attended Kenyon College in Ohio. A stint in the Army gave him a taste for European life, and he moved to Rome and then to Paris. He wrote a novel, a detective story called A Mirror for Magistrates, and fell in and out with Wright and other expatriate intellectuals. In 1957, Gibson left Paris and went to work for CBS Radio News. Okay, by this point, CBS Radio News was already co-opted by the CIA. According to his newspaper reports, with a colleague, he uncovered the Cuban Revolution that brought Fidel Castro to power. In 1960, Gibson, who then sympathized with leftist movements, co-founded the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which defended Castro's government from negative coverage in the North American press. Okay, here's the problem with that. 1960, Castro was not a goddamn communist, okay? So Gibson and Tabor, they go to freaking Cuba with the CIA under the guise of working for CBS News, okay? If it's the late 50s and you're getting face-to-face meetings with Castro, you work for the CIA. I'm sorry. They had that guy on lockdown. They did not just let any Tom, Dick, and Harry go in there and interview him, okay? These guys worked for the CIA back in the 1950s. And in 1960, when Fair Play for Cuba Committee was founded, he was still on our side. He was not a communist. So they formed the Fair Play for Cuba Committee to glorify Castro because he's on our side still, right? They tried to get the American people on board to get behind Cuba, so as to gave the sentiment of the American people. But guess what? Fidel Castro throws him a fast one. In 1961, he aligns with the Soviet Union, becomes a communist. But guess what? What do Gibson and Tabor do with their Fair Play for Cuba Committee? Do they denounce him and say, no, he went communist, fuck him? No. They kept up the front of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and they continued to push now pro-communist, pro-Castro agenda. Why'd they do this? It was a fucking front. That's why. But the fact that it was founded in 60 and in 61, then he switched, but they didn't. That to me would kind of let the cat out of the bag, right? So this is ridiculous. These guys were fucking white guys from fucking Brooklyn. They're not Cubans. This was CIA work all day long. Okay, it's ridiculous. This is a little bit about Robert Tabor. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say it's just like today when everybody's a white supremacist, and the white supremacists are being accused of doing the GameStop crash and everything like that. It's ridiculous.
God damn it! There are no organized white supremacists in this country. Okay, and if there are, they're funded by the fucking ADL, just like the American Nazi Party. American Nazi Party got busted up in like 1946 after the war, 47 after the war. When they were audited, turned out they were funded by the fucking ADL. Okay, this is controlled opposition. It's all white supremacy is in this country. It doesn't exist. All right. People are racist. People are racist assholes. That's reality. Okay. It doesn't make them white supremacists.
Yeah, but that's the new fucking hot phrase for them now is everybody who doesn't go along with the narrative is a white supremacist now, or conspiracy theorist, or QAnon, part of the QAnon group if you don't go along with it.
You want to go down that road? The Asians got us beat by leaps and bounds, okay? The Asians are supreme if you want to go down that fucking road. It's so fucking stupid. Like ethnic supremacy is the dumbest shit on the planet. It's the last metric that should ever be used to judge anybody. God damn, I hate fucking that shit. Okay, so this just talks about like Robert Tabor, the other guy. You know, he traveled to Cuba in the 1950s, investigative journalist. The fucking guys are CIA. I'm not even going to waste my time explaining it. Okay, and we're on to the three tramps. I've already done extensive talks on the three tramps, and so I'm not really going to cover too much today, but this is what Littman says about this. The truth emerged in 1993 when the Dallas City Council released its JFK assassination records. Journalist Mary LaFontaine found arrest records that showed the tramps were exactly that, tramps. Their names were Harold Doyle, John Gedney, and Gus Abrams. Two of the tramps were still alive, and they said that the night before the assassination, they had spent the night at a rescue mission, gotten fresh clothes, showered, shaved, and ate. They went back to the railway yards, and they were arrested after the assassination. John Gedney told the FBI they were held for 4 to 6 days and then released. Okay, so basically, you've got Litwin. This is how when I say that researchers are fucking lazy, this is what I mean. He's taking the word of someone else. So I took someone else's word for it once, and I screwed up bad, and I put out a video identifying Jean-Pierre Lafitte as the Knoll shooter, and I was fucking wrong, and I had to take it down. And I realized I was wrong through my own research. This asshole, what he did was he just took somebody's word for it. Oh, they found who they were. Great. I'll just take their word for it. Okay, if you're just taking people's word for shit, you're not a researcher. You're a show. So, three tramps that went wrong again. Like I said, I'm not going to go into this for too much because I already did a 2-hour presentation on the tramps alone. So,
is that one still up on YouTube?
Yes, that one's still on YouTube.
Yeah, you can find that.
Okay, so
to find out more.
2 sets of tramps were taken into custody from the railroad cars. The first set was detained almost immediately after the assassination. The tramps that the world has come to know were not detained until nearly 2 hours after the assassination. This is apparent as the streets in these photos are nearly empty and the crowds have already dispersed. Someone high up the chain attempted to confuse the public by associating these tramps, who were arrested around 2:30, with the earlier arrested tramps whose identity was determined to be Gus Abrams, John Forster Gedney, and Harold Doyle. So fundamentally, here are the documents on these guys. They were arrested, it says right here, right after the president was shot, which is true. These guys got jacked out of a flatbed car by about 50 cops. Okay, they were all in the railroad yard. They saw them, they jacked them off the thing, and they took them off to jail. Now, the tramps that we all know and love are all right, so the short tramp is Vincent Calderon Jr., the tall tramp is Danny Green, and the old tramp is Leo Masseri out of Cleveland. And so the bottom line is that was 2 hours after this, okay? So I'm not going to go into all these notes. All these notes you guys have already seen before. But when you actually go through these documents here and you read through like the sections I have highlighted, it becomes blatantly obvious. You had 2 different sets of cops. You had 2 different sets of reports. You had 2 different sets of everything. There were 2 different sets of tramps, okay? That is reality. And so Mr. Litwin's book really requires a part 2 to this. There's a whole lot more that I can actually show documents to the contrary of what he tries to put forth. But I believe that is going to be it for tonight. We will have to finish Mr. Litwin another time. But for the most part, I think I made my point, is that he comes out here, he doesn't have a thesis in his book. He just tries to make Garrison look crazy. Can you kill my screen share? And then he claims to have like an insight from who the fuck knows where. It's really frustrating. I just hate dealing with people like that.
And now, so what's your conclusion? You think it was just stupidity or disinformation intentional?
No, I think there's a couple different. Sometimes I would say it's stupidity. Sometimes I would say it's people disinformation. But this guy, I get the feeling that he just wanted to make a name for himself as going against the flowing
That's
against
the worst
the stream.
ever. That's worse than all of them.
And it's horrible because like he really doesn't know what he's talking about. And when you read how he wrote his book, he actually flew around the country to places and pulled actual documents. He could have saved himself the money and gone on newspapers.com and debunked his own fucking work before he ever put it out. But this is going to end up having to be a series or its own show because there's so much bullshit out there that I have to debunk. Debunking everything won't cover it. This will be like on the trail of the debunkers. Because I already got like 2 or 3 JFK movies I have to debunk. I got a whole bunch of other stuff. So, but fundamentally, yeah, I take it personally when motherfuckers come out there and say Oswald did it. Okay. It shits on the work that I've done. It shits on the work that Garrison did. And it's the same fucking people who are doing it to our world today. And I can connect all those dots. And, when you look at the tactics that they use, like from the Karl Rove document, they try to discredit everyone else. That's all it is. It's poor attempts to use, elements of psych warfare to discredit a narrative. And it's the
same thing that's happening now.
Any questions?
Let's see if we have any. If anyone has any questions, please leave them in the chat now. Let me go through and see. No, I don't really have any questions from the chat, but be sure and get your tickets to Forbidden Knowledge News Con right now. He's going to be doing like I said, probably a 6-hour or 7.
Yeah, it's going to be long.
Huge presentation. You won't want to miss it.
So it's going to be Saturday night, the 3rd, and I don't even remember what time I think I'm supposed to get done at like 10 Eastern. It's going to be like 8 o'clock Eastern time. I am going to talk till I literally pass out because what I'm going to do is I'm putting together the actual chain of events that day, right? So bullets get fired, who went where, who got arrested where. I'm using a lot of the research for it is coming from like the radio logs and from third-party sources and all kinds of stuff. There's all kinds of good stuff in the Garrison documents no one ever talks about. That's like puts people like Clay Shaw possibly in Dealey Plaza. So. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. It's gonna be long as hell.
Definitely. So visit forbiddenknowledge.news or click the link in the description. You can get your tickets now. And also get yourself a free crypto miner. It's awesome, man. You get free money. And until next time, everyone have an excellent evening.